How far can an empire go to consolidate its authority over vast territories and diverse populations? In the French colonial empire, punishment was far more than an act of correction. It became a calculated spectacle meant to send a clear and terrifying message. From exhausting forced labor to physical punishments that defied the limits of humanity, these practices were designed to break not only the body, but also the spirit. They were not mere measures of discipline, but tools of domination that kept millions under a regime of fear and absolute subjugation. But what methods of torture and punishment were used to impose this control? The guillotine, the axe of justice. The guillotine, originally conceived as a symbol of justice during the French Revolution, evolved into a weapon of absolute control in the French colonies. Within the extensive colonial domain, this instrument, renowned for its efficiency, shifted from a judicial tool to a means of domination. Its blade fell not only on those who broke the law, but also on those perceived as threats to the order imposed by the empire. Introduced to the French colonies in the 19th century, the guillotine became a public spectacle designed to instill respect and fear. Unlike in Europe, where its use was justified as a measure of impartial justice, in the colonies it served a different purpose: to reinforce the supremacy of the French regime over local populations. In Algeria, where the guillotine saw significant use, it is estimated that between 1830 and 1962, thousands were publicly executed under its blade. These executions punished crimes considered severe, such as insurrection or conspiracy, but also served as a collective warning to quell resistance movements against French occupation. Guillotine executions were rarely private acts. They were often conducted in public squares and before large crowds, orchestrated by colonial authorities. In Indochina, for example, executions were announced days in advance, attracting villagers from nearby regions. Historical records show that in 1908, a Vietnamese rebel leader was guillotined before hundreds of people as part of a strategy to demoralize his followers. In 1923, records describe how a group of rebels was publicly executed in a Dakar square after attempting to organize an uprising against the labor system imposed by the French. These events were designed to ensure that local populations understood the consequences of defying colonial authority. The guillotine was not used indiscriminately. While corporal punishments like flogging or whipping were common for minor infractions, this method of execution was reserved for high-profile cases. Political dissidents, leaders of independence movements, and rebels were the primary targets. Its purpose was not only to physically eliminate opponents, but also to destroy the morale of their followers. The use of the guillotine in French colonies began to decline in the mid-20th century, coinciding with decolonization movements and increased international scrutiny of colonial practices. However, its impact endured. The legacy of the guillotine in French colonies highlights not only its role as an instrument of justice, but also as a tool of deterrence and control in a system designed to maintain imperial hegemony. Through its blade, the guillotine secured its place as a dual symbol: justice for some and terror for others, reflecting the complex relationship between power, law, and domination in the colonial context. The breaking wheel. The most brutal punishment among the execution methods employed during the early years of French colonization, the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, stood out for its brutality and the visual impact of its application. Although its use was limited in the colonies, its reputation made it a terrifying symbol of colonial justice, marking a grim chapter in the history of the French Empire. The breaking wheel was a meticulously designed method of execution aimed at causing maximum pain and prolonging suffering. The condemned was tied to a wooden wheel with arms and legs extended over its spokes. Then, using iron bars or other heavy instruments, executioners systematically broke the bones of the limbs, starting at the ankles and moving toward the torso. In some cases, the condemned was placed face up so the final blow could fall on the chest, hastening death. However,
In more cruel executions, the victim was left alive for hours or even days, exposed to the public until they succumbed. The public nature of this punishment amplified its impact. In the plazas and communal spaces where it was carried out, spectators were forced to witness the slow process, while authorities used these events as a reminder of the regime's absolute control. Albert Londres, a 20th century French journalist, traveled extensively across French colonies, using his pen to expose the inhumane conditions defining life under colonial rule. In his reports, Londres vividly described exploitation in places such as French Guiana, notorious for its brutal penal system, and Algeria, where the disparities between colonizers and the colonized were overwhelming. A documented case in New Orleans describes the execution of an enslaved person who led a mass escape attempt in 1730. He was tied to the wheel and publicly executed as a warning to others. The complexity of the procedure and the level of coordination required made this punishment reserved for situations where authorities sought significant impact on the local population. During the latter half of the 18th century, Lou Congo, a black executioner in New Orleans, was tasked with administering various forms of punishment in the colony, including flogging and the breaking wheel. As an enslaved man himself, Congo personified the disturbing power dynamics within colonial society. His role as an executor of brutal punishments reflects how authorities used even the oppressed to maintain control over their communities. The use of the wheel in French colonies was not coincidental. The colonial administration sought to reinforce its authority in distant territories where revolts and discontent were constant. The breaking wheel served as a deterrent mechanism. Although rarely used, its mere existence helped maintain order by instilling deep fear in communities. In Caribbean colonies such as Martinique and Guadeloupe, the wheel was implemented in exceptional cases, such as that of a sailor convicted of murder in 1758, who was publicly executed in the main port. Historical records suggest these executions attracted large crowds and were organized to impact both colonists and enslaved populations. By the 19th century, the breaking wheel fell out of use, replaced by execution methods deemed faster and more practical, such as the guillotine. This shift reflected not only advancements in punishment techniques, but also an evolution in colonial strategies, which began prioritizing efficiency over public spectacle. Despite its disappearance, the wheel left a deep imprint on the collective memory of the colonies as a symbol of power dynamics in the colonial system. This extreme punishment represented one of the rawest manifestations of the absolute control exercised by the French regime. Though its use was limited, the breaking wheel remained an emblem of the harshest justice and an extreme deterrent tool. Its legacy is still remembered as one of the most atrocious practices within the French colonial system, underscoring the dynamics of control and repression that characterize this period in history. Flogging and whipping. Methods of punishment in the French colonial empire, such as flogging and whipping, became routine practices within the disciplinary strategies of the French colonial empire. These forms of physical punishment were legally sanctioned under the Code de l'Indigénat, enacted in 1881, a set of laws that granted colonial authorities broad powers to impose penalties on indigenous populations without the need for formal judicial processes. Caning was typically carried out with wooden rods or bamboo sticks, while whipping involved braided leather straps. The number of blows depended on the offense and was determined by colonial administrators or local chiefs under the supervision of the French regime. These punishments were often conducted in public squares or workplaces in the presence of community members. A 1908 record from Senegal details how a young man was sentenced to 25 strokes for refusing to participate in a construction project overseen by colonial authorities. On plantations in Indochina, workers who failed to meet production quotas received between 10 and 50 lashes, according to official documents from the period. In 1912, a government report mentions punishments in villages that failed to meet tax quotas. In one locality in Niger,
Several men were publicly caned for delays in payments demanded by the local administration. In 1923, a group of farmers protesting against land expropriation was subjected to collective whippings, as noted in colonial archives. Each person received between 20 and 30 strokes. In 1930, during a strike at a rubber plantation, several workers were publicly whipped for not returning to work after an ultimatum from the authorities. Company records mention the use of this method as a measure of immediate deterrence. The Code de l'Indigénat stipulated that physical punishments could be imposed for offences such as disobeying orders, delays in tax payments, or failure to participate in mandatory labour. The absence of an appeal system ensured that these sanctions were executed swiftly and without formal resistance. In Senegal, a 1910 case details how a man was sentenced to 30 strokes for not attending the construction of a road in his region. Historical documents describe the event as an ordinary disciplinary action implemented to ensure compliance with colonial directives. Physical punishments remained in use in several French colonies until the 1940s, when they began to be questioned due to growing international criticism of colonial practices. However, reports from the time show that these methods were still common in rural areas where the colonial administration maintained direct control over local populations. The historical record of these punishments reflects a system organized to prioritize the immediate execution of sanctions as part of the administrative policies of the French colonial empire. Branding with hot irons, a mark of domination. Branding with hot irons was one of the most widely used methods to exert control and discipline in the colonies of the French Empire. Originating in the penal system of metropolitan France, this punishment evolved in the colonies, taking on more violent and oppressive connotations, especially in the context of slavery. The practice, which involved applying a heated iron to the skin to engrave symbols or initials, not only punished the individual, but also sent a clear message to local communities. Branding was primarily used to identify and punish those deemed criminals or insubordinate. In the Caribbean, particularly in Haiti and Martinique, this practice was common during the 17th and 18th centuries. Individuals convicted of theft, desertion, or rebellion were branded with hot irons that inscribed letters such as V for voleur, thief, or specific symbols of colonial authorities. In the system of slavery, branding took on an additional purpose. Enslaved Africans were frequently branded with the initials of their owners, plantation symbols, or emblems of colonial authority. This process, usually conducted upon arrival at ports or after a purchase, was justified as a form of registration to indicate ownership. The mark, permanent and unalterable, became a physical emblem reinforcing the subjugation of enslaved individuals within the colonial hierarchy. Branding with hot irons became particularly symbolic during the Haitian Revolution. In Haiti, then known as Saint-Domingue, this practice represented one of the most visible forms of dehumanization and oppression exercised over the enslaved population. Accounts from the time recount how marks on the bodies of captured rebels were used to identify their allegiance to specific factions or their history of insubordination. During this period, branding became a focal point of resistance. Revolutionary leaders such as Toussaint Louverture emphasized the eradication of these practices and denounced their oppressive symbolism, using the abolition of branding as a banner in the fight for freedom. As the revolutionary movement advanced, branding not only diminished but began to be regarded as a tangible reminder of the atrocities of the colonial regime. In France, branding was officially abolished in 1832 as part of a reform of the penal system. However, in the colonies, the practice continued clandestinely or with local justifications for several more decades. Reports from the mid-19th century indicate that in territories such as Guadeloupe and Guyana, branding was still used to identify contract workers, particularly on plantations. The slow abandonment of this practice reflects the disparities between policies applied in the metropole and the colonies. While France sought to project a more civilized image, the colonies remained fertile ground for repressive methods that maintained control over local populations. Forced labor camps, the exploitation machine of the French colonial empire. At the heart of the French colonial system, forced labor camps emerged as one of the most effective tools for sustaining the imperial economy and maintaining control over colonized populations. These camps, established in territories such as French Guiana, Madagascar, and West Africa, were used not only to exploit natural resources, but also to punish those who challenged colonial authority. Forced labor was implemented as a means of maximizing economic productivity in resource-rich regions. In West Africa, for example, the construction of infrastructure such as railways and roads heavily depended on the forced labor of indigenous populations. Under the Code de l'Indigénat, local men were conscripted for compulsory labor, often without compensation, and subjected to grueling workdays under the direct supervision of colonial administrators. In Madagascar, during the early decades of the 20th century, thousands of men were forced to work on agricultural and infrastructure projects aimed at consolidating French control over the island. Colonial records describe how these workers faced poor health conditions, insufficient food, and physical punishment for failing to meet assigned goals. Among the forced labor camps established by the French Empire, the one on Devil's Island in French Guiana stood out as one of the most brutal. Founded in the 19th century, this camp became a site of extreme punishment, particularly for political prisoners and convicted criminals. Living conditions on the island were infamous. Inmates faced malnutrition, diseases such as malaria, and endless days of labor under a hostile tropical climate. Devil's Island gained notoriety during the Dreyfus Affair, when French army officer Alfred Dreyfus was sent there after being falsely accused of treason. Although he was eventually exonerated, his ordeal exposed the inhumane conditions of the camp, drawing international attention. The inmates included not only common criminals, but also political dissidents who opposed the French regime. During events such as the Paris Commune of 1871, French authorities used the physical removal of these individuals as a way to neutralize threats to colonial power, while the harsh conditions of the camps served as a warning to potential dissenters. The forced labor system was not limited to economic exploitation. It also functioned as a method of social and political control. Those who resisted colonial policies were sent to these camps as a form of exemplary punishment. The brutal conditions were designed to break not only individuals, but also the communities from which they came, discouraging any attempts at rebellion. However, this practice also had unintended consequences. The harsh conditions and mass deaths in the camps generated criticism both within and outside France, particularly from the 1930s onwards, as the anti-colonial movement began to gain momentum. Survivors' testimonies, along with reports from researchers and journalists, exposed the abuses committed in the name of productivity and control. The forced labor system was progressively dismantled after World War II as growing international pressure and anti-colonial mobilization forced France to reconsider its policies in the colonies. Nevertheless, the impact of these camps left a lasting mark on the affected regions, both in terms of social devastation and collective memory. Today, forced labor camps in the French Empire are remembered as one of the most oppressive tools used to sustain colonialism. Devil's Island, in particular, has become a symbol of the atrocities associated with this system, illustrating how the French Empire relied not only on economic exploitation, but also on extreme punishment to maintain its hegemony. Torture in colonial prisons, the hidden horror of the French Empire. French colonial repression was not only executed in public squares and streets as a spectacle of warning, but also operated in the shadows, within prisons, where violence was applied without restraint. While public executions and punishments aimed to instill fear in the population, detention centers served as laboratories of torture, designed to break political prisoners insurgents, and anyone deemed a threat to the colonial regime. These methods, documented in colonies such as Algeria and Indochina, reveal a punishment system based on systematic brutality. Techniques such as sensory deprivation, controlled asphyxiation, extreme overcrowding, and mock executions were employed to crush the will of detainees. Beyond the walls of colonial prisons, these torments remained unknown to the public, but within them, every punishment was designed to dehumanize and destroy the prisoner's psychological resistance. One of the most effective methods used to break detainees in French colonial prisons was sensory deprivation, which involved isolating prisoners from any external stimuli for prolonged periods. Inmates were locked in completely dark cells with no contact with other people and no access to sound or natural light. In many cases, they spent days, weeks, or even months without knowing whether it was day or night. The lack of human interaction and extreme disorientation had devastating effects on the mind. Many prisoners developed hallucinations, severe anxiety, and a loss of time perception, making them more susceptible to manipulation and prone to confessing under a state of total despair. This method was widely used in Algeria against members of the National Liberation Front, FLN, who were captured and confined in underground windowless cells. In Indochina, political prisoners were locked in cramped spaces where they could not move freely, subjected to absolute silence that gradually deteriorated their mental state. Another recurrent method in colonial detention centers was controlled asphyxiation, used to induce a sensation of drowning without causing immediate death. In some cases, cloth bags were placed over the prisoners' heads and tightened until they lost consciousness. Once the victim fainted, the bag was removed to allow them to breathe, only for the process to be repeated over and over again. In Algeria, a variation of this method involved the use of water. Prisoners were repeatedly submerged in barrels or tanks in a technique similar to waterboarding. This practice induced extreme panic, making detainees believe they were about to die, forcing them to confess under a state of absolute terror. Mock executions were another mechanism used to subjugate prisoners. In many cases, detainees were taken from their cells with their eyes blindfolded, transported to remote locations, and lined up before a firing squad. They were made to hear the sounds of weapons being loaded and were given the order to prepare for death. At the last moment, shots were fired into the air, or they were simply returned to their cells. This method aimed to completely break the prisoner's psychological resistance, leaving them in a constant state of fear of death. Inhumane living conditions. Beyond physical and psychological torture, the living conditions in colonial prisons were a punishment in themselves. In many cases, prisoners did not need to be interrogated or beaten to die, as disease, starvation, and lack of hygiene slowly killed them. In Indochina, detainees were crammed into tiny, unventilated cells. The suffocating heat and humidity turned these spaces into death traps where diseases spread uncontrollably. The scarcity of drinking water and inadequate food quickly weakened prisoners, many of whom did not survive more than a few months in captivity. In Algeria, some prisoners were confined in outdoor cages, exposed to the scorching sun during the day and the freezing cold at night. Insect bites, dehydration, and constant fatigue weakened detainees to the point of death. Extrajudicial executions within prisons were also common. In some cases, guards simply stopped feeding certain prisoners or systematically beat them until they died from their injuries. These deaths were recorded as illness-related fatalities to cover up the crimes committed within the prisons. French colonial prisons were not mere detention centers, but places where torture was used as a tool of absolute control. Away from the public eye, far from the official discourse of civilization and progress, these detention centers functioned as machines of suffering where prisoners' lives had no value. The combination of sensory deprivation, asphyxiation, mock executions, and inhumane living conditions not only punished prisoners, but also sent a clear message to those who remained free in the colonial system. It was not enough to physically subdue insurgents and dissidents. It was necessary to destroy their will and ensure that fear spread beyond the prison walls. When violence in the streets was not enough to crush resistance, prisons became the last resort of colonial terror. Within their walls, punishment was not merely an act of repression, but a slow death sentence carried out without witnesses and with no possibility of escape. The pillar, public humiliation. The pillar, a seemingly simple wooden or metal structure designed to immobilize the head and hands of a condemned person, became a symbol of public humiliation in the French colonial empire. Although originating in Europe as a punishment for minor offenses, in the French colonies this practice took on a harsher character, especially when used against enslaved, indigenous, and forced labor populations. The process was straightforward. The condemned individual was placed in a frame that restricted mobility, often in a public location such as a square or market, for hours or even days. The person had to endure not only the physical discomfort of the forced position, but also the humiliation of being subjected to ridicule, insults, and in some cases physical aggression from onlookers. In the colonies, this punishment was often combined with additional acts of cruelty. Historical records recount cases where individuals in the pillar were beaten by colonial overseers or pelted with objects by the crowd. The objective was not only to degrade the punished individual, but also to send a clear message of submission to the entire community. The pillar was particularly prominent in Caribbean colonies such as Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, where it was used extensively against the enslaved population. Historical records indicate that enslaved people who disobeyed their masters, attempted to escape, or simply questioned orders could be placed in the pillar for extended hours under the scorching sun. In Saint-Domingue, this method was common on plantations, where it was imposed as a punishment for minor infractions such as tardiness or prohibited conversations. However, it was also used in response to rebellion attempts, with the severity of the punishment increased by acts such as public beatings before or after being placed in the structure. In French West Africa, the pillar was employed against indigenous populations who failed to meet forced labor quotas or resisted colonial authority. In villages and urban centers, public squares became stages where the condemned remained exposed for hours while the community was compelled to witness the act. Unlike direct physical punishments such as flogging, the pillar had a dual purpose: to sanction the individual while reinforcing the social hierarchy before the rest of the population. The act of being observed by colonizers, overseers, and peers transformed the experience of punishment into a collective event. This served as a warning against any form of resistance and maintained the colonial power structure. By the early 19th century, the use of the pillar began to decline in French colonies. This decline was linked to the introduction of more formal prison systems and the development of punishment methods perceived as more civilized. Despite its abandonment, the pillar left a deep impression on the memory of affected communities. In particular, its use in regions such as Haiti contributed to the resentment that fueled revolution and emancipation movements. The memory of this punishment, combined with other forms of colonial repression, remains a reminder of the tools used to maintain control in the French Empire.
Colonized bodies, sexual abuse as a weapon of imperial power. The French colonial period was characterized by systematic exploitation that extended far beyond economics and politics. In this context, sexual violence became an effective mechanism for consolidating domination over colonized populations. Enabled by a deeply unequal and racist system, this form of violence was both an expression of the colonizers' absolute control and a tool to demoralize and weaken subjugated communities. The bodies of colonized women, fetishized and dehumanized, became the target of abuse, normalized by the legal and social structures of the colonial regime. In the colonies, the absolute inequality of power played a fundamental role in perpetuating these abuses. Colonizers, whether administrators, soldiers, or civilians, wielded unquestionable authority over the lives of colonized people. This total control allowed them to exercise physical and sexual violence with impunity, while colonial laws protected their actions. In this environment, local women, deprived of any form of legal protection, found themselves in a position of complete vulnerability. Thus, the power structure not only facilitated abuse, but legitimized it as an extension of colonial dominance. Racist dehumanization also played a crucial role in this phenomenon. Colonial ideologies promoted the notion that subjugated populations were primitive, exotic, and ultimately inferior. These deeply ingrained narratives portrayed colonized women as sexualized objects, perpetuating the belief that their bodies were accessible to colonizers. In this context, women were seen not as individuals with rights, but as spoils of the colonial project. This perception intensified during conflicts, where sexual violence was used as a collective reprisal against rebellious communities. Structural impunity ensured that perpetrators rarely faced legal consequences. In the colonies, laws were designed to protect European settlers while systematically ignoring the testimonies of local victims. If a colonized woman reported a rape, her word was deemed invalid against that of her aggressor. This culture of impunity not only perpetuated abuse, but also sent a clear message to victims: there was no possibility of justice for them. This was especially evident in cases where the perpetrators were soldiers or officials who, as representatives of the empire, enjoyed absolute immunity. Sexual abuse was not limited to individual acts, but was also part of daily life in forced labor systems, on plantations, in mines, and in infrastructure projects. Colonized women worked under the constant supervision of European overseers and administrators, regularly exposing them to sexual assault. Similarly, during military campaigns and raids against communities resisting colonial rule, rape was used as a collective weapon to punish and subdue local populations. In these contexts, abuse was not merely an expression of violence, but a deliberate tactic to instill fear and deter resistance. The impact of this sexual violence extended beyond individual victims, affecting entire communities. Women who survived such abuse faced extreme stigma within their own communities, where speaking out about rape could result in social ostracism or rejection. This forced silence perpetuated abuse, while children born of rape faced double stigmatization, first for being the product of a non-consensual act, and second, for being mixed race in a system that valued European racial purity. These dynamics contributed to social fragmentation, making it harder for communities to organize and resist collectively. Concrete examples of these practices shed light on the impact of sexual abuse in French colonies. During the occupation of Algeria, particularly during the War of Independence, 1954 to 1962, rapes were used as reprisals against communities supporting the rebels. In French West Africa, women working on road construction or in resource extraction were constantly exposed to abuse by overseers and soldiers. In French Indochina, Vietnamese and Cambodian women faced dual exploitation, subjected to sexual abuse on plantations, and simultaneously fetishized under the European Orientalist narrative of the submissive woman. The legacy of sexual violence in the French colonial context stands as a testament to the use of abuse as a weapon of domination. Beyond economic and political exploitation, control over colonized bodies became a central piece of the imperial project. Although these practices were silenced for a long time, their impact persists in the historical memory and social dynamics of former colonies, serving as a reminder of the horrors of a system that weaponized violence in all its forms.
Forced disappearance, when punishment becomes oblivion. In the French colonial system, repression was not limited to public executions, prison torture, or forced labor. To eliminate any threat to the regime, an even more effective method was employed: forced disappearance. This punishment not only physically removed the victim, but also erased their existence, leaving families and communities without answers, without bodies, and without justice. In colonies such as Algeria and Indochina, forced disappearance became a common practice against rebel leaders, political activists, and figures deemed dangerous by the regime. Arbitrary arrests, nighttime abductions, and clandestine executions were used as terror tactics by colonial forces to suppress any attempts at resistance. During the Algerian War of Independence, 1954 to 1962, French forces implemented forced disappearance as part of their counterinsurgency strategy. Thousands of Algerians were arrested by the military, police, and special units such as the paratroopers, never to be seen again. The abducted individuals were taken to secret detention centers where they were interrogated and tortured. Some were executed in secret, their bodies dumped into mass graves, rivers, or even the Mediterranean Sea. Others were transported by helicopter and thrown alive from the air in a practice known as les crevettes Bijard, Bijard's shrimp, named after French General Marcel Bijard, who justified this method as a quick elimination of enemies. One of the most well-documented cases was the disappearance of Maurice Audin, a French mathematician and communist militant who supported Algerian independence. He was arrested in 1957 by French forces and was never seen again. For decades, the French government denied his execution until in 2018 it officially acknowledged that Audin had been murdered under torture and his body had been disappeared. Forced disappearance was also used against civilians accused of collaborating with the National Liberation Front (FLN). Men, women, and even teenagers were arrested under suspicion, but instead of being tried or imprisoned, they simply vanished. Their families never received information about their whereabouts, and any attempt to demand answers was met with repression. During the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, the French army employed similar tactics against Viet Minh fighters, the independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh. Forced disappearances were used to dismantle Vietnamese resistance and instill terror among the population. Colonial forces arrested communist leaders, strike organizers, and Viet Minh sympathizers. Some were sent to concentration camps such as Polo Condor, where they slowly perished under inhumane conditions. Others were executed in secret, their bodies never returned. In some regions, entire villages were subjected to mass disappearances. When the French suspected that a village supported the Viet Minh, its inhabitants could be arrested without record and taken to unknown locations. Summary executions in the jungle became a recurrent practice, with bodies dumped in rivers or buried in undocumented mass graves. Forced disappearances served a dual purpose. Not only did they physically eliminate opponents, but they also created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty in society. Without bodies or concrete evidence, families were left trapped in an endless search, with no answers and no opportunity to grieve. Colonial forces used various methods to erase all traces of their crimes: clandestine mass graves in Algeria, prisoners thrown into the Mediterranean Sea with cement blocks tied to their bodies, systematic denial by colonial authorities who told families their loved ones had escaped or joined the rebels. This legal vacuum prevented any kind of investigation and silenced families demanding justice. Forced disappearance had a devastating effect on colonized societies. It not only eliminated leaders of resistance movements, but also fostered a culture of fear in which no one dared challenge colonial authority. In Algeria, the tactic spread terror among independence supporters. Many opponents chose exile rather than risk abduction. The uncertainty surrounding the fate of thousands of disappeared individuals remains a subject of historical memory in Algeria to this day. In Vietnam, the use of forced disappearances fueled hatred toward French rule and further radicalized the struggle for independence. With each disappeared leader, the Viet Minh found new reasons to intensify resistance until they ultimately achieved victory in 1954. Forced disappearances were one of the most extreme methods employed by the French colonial regime. They were not just about punishment or executions, but about the total annihilation of a person and their memory. Bodies were never recovered, stories remained uncertain, and families were condemned to an endless wait. When public repression and prison torture were not enough, the empire resorted to its most effective weapon, making its enemies disappear without a trace. In the history of French colonialism, few tactics were as brutal, and few left such a profound mark on the nations that fought for their independence. Witnesses, emblematic figures of French colonial methods. The French colonial empire, renowned for its vast territories and economic power, implemented a variety of oppressive methods to maintain control over colonized populations. However, throughout history, numerous emblematic figures testified, denounced, or fought against these tactics, leaving a legacy of resistance, documentation, and critical analysis. A 20th-century French journalist, Albert Londres, traveled extensively across French colonies, using his pen to expose the inhumane conditions defining life under colonial rule. In his reports, he vividly described exploitation in places such as French Guiana, notorious for its brutal penal system, and Algeria, where disparities between colonizers and colonized were overwhelming. Londres not only documented forced labor, but also revealed the impact of oppressive policies on indigenous communities. His writings caused an uproar in France and raised public awareness about colonial realities, making him one of the first voices to openly question the narrative of France's civilizing mission. A poet and politician from Martinique, Aimé Césaire, was a central figure in the Negritude movement, which sought to reclaim African and Caribbean identity in the face of colonial oppression. Through works such as Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, Notebook of a Return to My Native Land, he described the profound injustices and dehumanization of French rule in the Caribbean. His critique extended beyond physical abuses, addressing how the colonial system destroyed cultural identities and reduced colonized populations to mere instruments of production. As a politician, he led efforts to grant greater rights to French overseas territories, leaving a legacy of struggle that influenced generations of activists. Leader of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture was a pivotal figure in the fight against French colonial domination. Although he lived before some of the more institutionalized practices of French colonialism developed, his life and work exemplified resistance against brutal tactics such as branding with hot irons, plantation exploitation, and punitive violence. Born enslaved, Louverture led a revolt that not only challenged the French Empire, but dismantled one of history's most infamous systems of exploitation, slavery in Saint-Domingue. His leadership demonstrated the fallibility of colonial tactics and inspired resistance movements worldwide. Although best known for exposing abuses in the Belgian Congo, Roger Casement also documented atrocities in other empires, including the French. His focus on systemic violence against colonized populations and his commitment to exposing inhumane conditions in European colonies helped develop global awareness of colonial abuses. Casement broadened the international debate on the ethics of colonial domination, highlighting how similar practices of exploitation were repeated across empires, including the French. His work inspired activists and journalists who continued exposing injustices of the colonial system. Theorist of decolonization, psychiatrist, and philosopher from Martinique, Frantz Fanon deeply examined the psychological and social implications of colonialism. In The Wretched of the Earth, he analyzed how structural violence, public punishment, and labor exploitation not only maintained physical control, but also sought to destroy the identity and self-esteem of subjugated populations. Fanon witnessed the most brutal methods of colonialism during the Algerian War of Independence, where torture, Rape and mass executions became common tactics of the French army. His theoretical analysis connected these practices to broader systems of domination, providing a framework for understanding liberation struggles worldwide.